May 1945. The Third Reich had crumbled into ash and silence, leaving behind only the bitter taste of defeat and the hollow echo of promises that would never be kept. Across Germany, surrender came not with the thunder of artillery, but with the quiet desperation of a nation that had believed its own lies for far too long. For those German women who had served in field hospitals, communication units, and auxiliary corps, captivity followed as swiftly as the collapse of their world. On May 15, 1945, a group of German female prisoners numbering just over 280 were loaded onto an American transport vessel at the port of Bremerhaven. Among them stood Greta Weber, a 26-year-old nurse from Munich, who had spent the final months of the war treating wounded soldiers with nothing but scraps of cloth and hope. Her medical bag, once filled with proper instruments, now contained only a bent thermometer and a journal she had managed to keep hidden from the initial searches. The ship's deck reeked of diesel fuel, salt spray, and unfamiliar American cigarettes. As Greta clutched the metal railing, she studied the guards who walked among the prisoners with an ease that seemed almost casual. These American soldiers, most barely out of their teens, moved with a confidence that struck her as alien. Their uniforms were pristine, their boots polished to a mirror shine, and their bodies carried a weight and height that defied everything she had been taught. She remembered the voice of her propaganda instructor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had assured them that American men were soft, weakened by years of capitalist excess and racial mixing. They lack the discipline and strength of the German warrior, he had declared with absolute certainty. Yet the young sergeant who offered her a cup of coffee that morning possessed arms like tree trunks and a steady gaze that spoke of anything but weakness. Beside her, Ingrid Hoffman, a 23-year-old radio operator from Berlin, whispered in disbelief as she watched the guards distribute food rations. "Look at the size of those portions," she breathed, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived on turnip soup and black bread for months. "And they're giving it to us. Prisoners." The voyage across the Atlantic stretched for 12 days. During those days, the German women experienced their first glimpse of the vast chasm between Nazi propaganda and American reality. Meals arrived 3 times daily, each one containing more protein and fresh food than most of the prisoners had seen in years. Canned peaches, white bread that wasn't made from sawdust, real butter, and portions of meat that seemed almost insulting in their abundance. Some prisoners ate hesitantly, convinced it was a psychological trick designed to soften them for interrogation. Others wept silently at the sight of sugar cubes, remembering children back home who had forgotten the taste of sweetness. When one guard casually discarded half a sandwich, Greta felt something crack inside her chest. In Munich, her patients had died fighting over crusts. When the transport finally entered New York Harbor, the city rose before them through the morning mist like something from a fever dream. Skyscrapers of steel and glass pierced the sky. Bridges arched across the water in impossible spans, and the harbor bustled with more ships than Greta had ever imagined could exist in one place. For many of the prisoners, it was their first sight of America beyond the twisted photographs used in wartime propaganda. Ingrid pressed her face against the small porthole window, her breath fogging the glass. "If this is what a dying nation looks like," she whispered, "then what were we told about victory?" They were transported inland by train, the rhythmic clatter of wheels carrying them through landscapes that mocked every lesson they had absorbed about American poverty and decline. Rolling farmlands stretched to the horizon, heavy with crops that seemed to grow without end. Cattle grazed in pastures so vast they disappeared into the distance. Small towns flashed past the windows, each one displaying a prosperity that made Germany's wartime shortages seem like a deliberate cruelty. Anna Richter, a 20-year-old medical student who had been conscripted in the war's final desperate months, pressed her journal against the window and began sketching what she saw. Grain silos rose like monuments to abundance. Automobiles crowded the roads in numbers that defied rationing. Even the children at small-town stations appeared healthier and stronger than the German soldiers she had treated in field hospitals. Their destination was Camp Shanks in New York, one of several facilities prepared to house female prisoners of war. As the train slowed and the camp came into view, Greta felt the last of her certainties begin to dissolve. The facility spread before them in ordered rows of clean wooden barracks, surrounded not by the harsh wire and guard towers of German imagination, but by simple fencing and guards who stood with relaxed attention rather than rigid brutality. The camp itself defied every expectation carved into their minds by years of Nazi indoctrination. Rows of wooden barracks stood clean and orderly, their windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from the kitchens and the clean smell of laundry drying on lines. Showers offered hot water that flowed endlessly, a luxury that had vanished from most German cities by 1943. Guards spoke with businesslike efficiency, sometimes even offering what seemed like genuine courtesy. When Greta asked a matron how long they were permitted to remain under the hot spray, the American woman looked puzzled. "Until you're clean, dear," she replied, as if the question itself was strange. The concept of unlimited hot water seemed as foreign to the German women as the idea of unlimited anything had become. The first days passed in a blur of medical examinations, uniform distribution, and orientation sessions. American doctors recorded heights and weights with methodical precision, their pencils scratching out figures that seemed to exist in a different universe. The average measurements revealed a truth that cut deeper than any propaganda film ever could. These American women, even the staff members, stood taller, weighed more, and displayed the kind of robust health that had become a memory in wartime Germany. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a Red Cross physician assigned to the camp, later wrote in her personal correspondence, "The German women stare at our charts as though we're performing magic tricks. Several broke down completely when told their weight placed them in what we consider a malnourished category. One asked if our scales were broken. Another insisted we must be using different measurement systems. The disbelief runs so deep it's almost philosophical." In the evenings, as crickets sang beyond the barracks walls, Greta, Ingrid, and Anna gathered in whispered conferences about everything they had witnessed. The casual way kitchen staff discarded leftover bread, the endless supply of soap and clean clothing, the confident manner in which guards moved as if they had never known hunger or shortage, or the desperate mathematics of rationing. Every detail struck them with the same devastating realization. The propaganda machine had built their understanding of the world on foundations of sand. The Americans weren't the weak, degenerate society they had been taught to despise. Instead, they possessed a strength so casual, so abundant, that they could afford to be generous even to their enemies. Yet, disbelief remained a powerful shield. Some prisoners constructed elaborate explanations to preserve their worldview. The guards were specially selected specimens, they whispered. The abundance was temporary theater, designed to break their spirits before the real interrogations began. The waste was deliberate propaganda, meant to demoralize them with false displays of plenty. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp settled into stillness and the distant sound of American trucks rumbled along nearby roads, doubt crept through the barracks like cold air through broken windows. Ingrid lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering the bombed-out factories of Berlin and comparing them to the endless stream of American vehicles she had seen. Anna filled page after page of her journal with observations that refused to fit the narrative she had been given. The psychological foundation they had built their lives upon began to shift. Every morning brought new evidence that the world was not what they had been told. Every meal reinforced the growing suspicion that their leaders had fed them lies along with their meager rations. Every interaction with guards who treated them like human beings rather than subhuman enemies chipped away at the edifice of racial superiority that had justified their war. When news arrived that other camps housed thousands of German prisoners, all receiving similar treatment, the scope of American capacity became impossible to deny. This wasn't a small-scale deception or a temporary show of strength. This was a nation that could afford to feed, house, and care for its enemies while simultaneously rebuilding a shattered world. Greta found herself remembering the confident predictions of Nazi officials, their assurances that American industrial capacity was a myth, that American soldiers lacked the will to fight, that American society would collapse under the pressure of total war. Standing in a camp where even the prisoners ate better than German civilians, those predictions seemed like the fantasies of madmen. The crack in their certainty had become a chasm, and through that gap, an uncomfortable truth began to emerge. They had not simply lost a war. They had been betrayed by the very people who claimed to protect them, fed illusions that made victory impossible and defeat inevitable. June 1945. Camp Shanks settled into its daily rhythms as summer heat warmed the wooden barracks where German women lived out the strange reality of their captivity. Reveille sounded at dawn, mess halls filled with the clatter of metal trays and the hum of English conversations the prisoners struggled to decode, and by evening the compound grew quiet under the watchful glow of floodlights. To outside observers, it appeared orderly and routine. To the German women inside, each day brought fresh evidence that everything they had believed about the world was wrong. Greta Weber found herself assigned to the camp infirmary, working under the supervision of American medics who seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of medical equipment. Each morning she cleaned wounds and administered treatments using supplies that arrived in endless streams: gauze bandages, antiseptic solutions, and actual penicillin, the miracle drug she had only heard whispered about in German hospitals. Back home, she had learned to boil metal instruments until they lost their edge and to ration bandages like precious metals. Here, Dr. Mitchell opened fresh packages without hesitation, discarded half-used bottles of medicine, and treated supplies as if the American industrial machine could replace anything within days. Greta found herself whispering, "wasteful," under her breath, the German word sounding almost like a prayer to anchor herself to the world she had known. Yet even as she spoke it, she understood that what seemed like waste to her was simply abundance to them. Ingrid Hoffman drew kitchen duty, where she encountered the true scale of American plenty for the first time. The storage room stretched longer than city blocks back home, filled with towering stacks of flour sacks, coffee crates, and canned goods arranged in military precision. She watched cooks crack dozens of eggs into massive bowls, whisk them with casual efficiency, then scrape untouched portions into garbage bins without a second thought. At first, she convinced herself this had to be performance, an elaborate show designed to break their morale. But week after week, the abundance continued. One evening, after watching a cook discard an entire loaf of fresh bread because it had a small tear in the crust, Ingrid collapsed against the storage room wall and wept. She remembered her younger brother in Berlin, how he had fought other children for potato peels during the final winter of the war. Anna Richter, driven by her medical training and scientific curiosity, began documenting everything in her journal with obsessive precision: the height and weight of guards, the daily caloric intake of prisoners, the number of supply trucks that entered the compound each week. She measured, calculated, and compared, desperate to find some logical explanation that would preserve her understanding of German superiority. Instead, every statistic she recorded pointed toward the same devastating conclusion. The America that Nazi propaganda had described as weak and declining was instead impossibly, almost insultingly strong. Her training demanded evidence, and the evidence surrounded her like an ocean of contradictions. The first letters home were permitted in July, though prisoners understood every word would pass through censors. Most wrote carefully, avoiding details that might be stripped away by black ink. Yet between the cautious lines, fragments of truth began to emerge. Greta wrote to her sister in Munich with deliberate understatement, "The conditions here are different than what we expected. There is sufficient food, clean water always available, and medical care when needed. I cannot explain more, only that nothing matches what we were told. Some women, however, refused to accept what their eyes reported daily. Whispered rumors spread through the barracks that the abundance was temporary, a calculated psychological operation designed to soften them before the real brutality began. "Americans are clever," insisted one former nurse, her voice shaking with the effort to maintain conviction. "They show us luxury now to make the coming punishment more terrible." But each day passed without cruelty materializing. Instead of torture, they received clean uniforms. Instead of starvation, they ate meals that surpassed anything available to German civilians. Instead of brutality, they encountered guards who sometimes smiled, who called them by their surnames with something approaching respect, who seemed genuinely puzzled when prisoners flinched at sudden movements. The most devastating revelation came with autumn's arrival, when American civilians from nearby towns began delivering supplies to the camp. These weren't soldiers or specially selected propagandists. They were ordinary workers, farmers, drivers, and clerks going about routine business. The German women watched them through the fence with growing horror, recognizing that even America's common citizens appeared healthier, stronger, and more prosperous than Germany's military elite. Anna pressed her face against the wire mesh, studying a truck driver who had stopped to chat with guards. His casual confidence, his obvious physical strength, his clean clothing and easy laughter struck her like physical blows. She scribbled frantically in her journal, "If their working class looks like this, what must their armies be? What did our leaders think they were fighting?" October 1945. The leaves outside Camp Shanks turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, painting the landscape in colors that seemed almost mockingly beautiful to women whose homeland lay in ruins. Inside the barracks, the German prisoners faced a transformation more profound than any seasonal change. The wall of propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world was crumbling, and with it, their sense of identity itself. The emotional breaking point arrived with a camp baseball game between off-duty American guards. The German women gathered at the fence to watch, curious about this strange American sport they had only heard described in dismissive terms by Nazi cultural ministers. What they witnessed instead was a display of athleticism that defied every stereotype they had been fed about American physical decline. Players sprinted across the diamond with explosive speed, launched balls across impossible distances, and moved with a coordination that spoke of lifelong health and nutrition. Their laughter echoed across the field as they played, the sound of men who had never known the hunger that had defined German life for years. Ingrid gripped the fence wire until her knuckles turned white. Remembering the propaganda posters that had depicted American soldiers as slouched, weak figures barely able to hold their rifles. "They move like athletes," Anna whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she observed. "Every single one of them looks stronger than our best soldiers." She thought of the German officers she had treated in field hospitals, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and stress, their movements careful and deliberate to conserve energy. Here, these Americans wasted energy on games, burned calories for entertainment, played with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their next meal. The psychological toll deepened with each passing day. Women who had once marched in confident formation now walked with uncertain steps, their conversations filled with questions that had no comfortable answers. Some began to grow angry, not at their captors, but at the leaders who had painted such elaborate lies about the world beyond Germany's borders. Greta found herself unable to concentrate on her medical duties, her hands shaking as she changed bandages with supplies more abundant than anything she had seen in German hospitals before the war even began. One afternoon, while disposing of unused surgical materials, she stopped and stared at the clean gauze in her hands. In Munich, she had watched patients die from infections that could have been prevented with a fraction of what Americans discarded daily. The letters that arrived from home in November brought devastating confirmation of what the prisoners had begun to suspect. Families wrote of continued rationing, of cities still in rubble, of a population struggling to survive in the aftermath of total defeat. The contrast with their own situation became unbearable. They were eating better as enemy prisoners than their own families were, as free citizens in occupied Germany. When news of the Nuremberg trials began filtering through official channels, accompanied by photographs and testimonies about concentration camps, many of the women experienced a secondary shock that dwarfed even their amazement at American abundance. The scale of atrocities committed in their name, the systematic nature of crimes they had never fully understood, the evidence of a moral bankruptcy that extended far beyond military defeat. Ingrid sat in the mess hall one evening, staring at her full plate while reading a heavily censored letter from her mother describing the ongoing food shortages in Berlin. The irony cut deeper than any physical wound. Her own government had starved its people while building factories of death, had sent armies to conquer abundance while allowing abundance to wither at home. "We were not just fighting a war we couldn't win," she said quietly to the others. "We were fighting for people who cared nothing about winning it." The realization hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and undeniable. Anna's journal entries from this period grew increasingly philosophical, moving beyond statistics to grapple with questions of truth and authority. She wrote, "If they lied to us about American weakness, about American society, about American character, then what else was fabrication? How do we distinguish between what we experienced and what we were told we experienced?" The camp seemed to grow quieter as autumn deepened into winter. Conversations in the barracks became subdued, introspective. Women who had once discussed return to Germany with eagerness now spoke of it with apprehension. What waited for them in a homeland that had fed them lies along with their inadequate rations? How could they face families who still believed in the mythology that had been so thoroughly shattered? Subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of World War II that challenge everything you thought you knew about history. December 1945. Snow began to fall across the Hudson Valley, transforming Camp Shanks into a landscape of pristine white that seemed to mock the moral darkness the German women had discovered within themselves. The barracks grew warm from furnaces that burned constantly, another casual display of abundance that reminded them daily of the coal shortages that had frozen German cities for years. To the prisoners, the endless heat felt like an accusation, each comfortable moment a reminder of promises their leaders had never intended to keep. The holiday season approached with decorations and celebrations that struck the German women as surreal. Christmas lights appeared throughout the camp, and American guards spoke of leave time to visit families, of presents waiting under trees, of abundance shared rather than hoarded. The casual nature of American Christmas preparations revealed yet another layer of the prosperity that had made Germany's defeat inevitable. Greta received a package from the Red Cross containing soap, chocolate, cigarettes, and warm socks. She turned each item over in her hands with something approaching reverence, remembering the Christmas of 1944 when her family had shared a single potato and called it a feast. The chocolate tasted impossibly rich, a luxury that had vanished from German shops years before the war's end. Yet even as she savored it, guilt gnawed at her conscience. Her patients back home had died while she now lived better than German officers. The psychological breaking point arrived during a mandatory information session about American war production. Through a translator, an American officer presented statistics that should have been impossible to believe. The United States had produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than 87,000 tanks, and Liberty ships at a rate that exceeded anything Germany had ever imagined possible. At first, the room erupted in whispers of disbelief. The numbers seemed like fantasy, exaggerations designed to demoralize defeated enemies. But Anna, her scientific training demanding verification, began calculating in the margins of her notebook. She compared these figures to everything she knew about German production, remembering the desperate shortages that had plagued every front, the constant appeals for metal donations, the ersatz materials that had replaced proper equipment. The mathematical reality struck her like a physical blow. Germany had never possessed even a fraction of America's industrial capacity. The war had been lost before it began, not through lack of courage or determination, but through a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's true strength. Her pencil trembled as she wrote a single word in her journal: impossible. The emotional collapse was not uniform across the camp. Some women responded with deeper denial, constructing elaborate theories about American deception and staged abundance. Others turned their growing fury inward toward the leaders who had sent them into an unwinnable conflict, armed with lies instead of truth. But most simply felt hollow, as if the foundation of their identity had been excavated and nothing remained to build upon. One evening during roll call, a former communications officer named Helga Kruger suddenly began shouting in German, her voice carrying across the silent compound, "They knew! They had to know we couldn't win!" The words hung in the winter air like visible breath, and no one moved to silence her or argue. The truth had become too obvious to deny, too painful to defend against. That night, Greta wrote in her own journal with careful precision, "We were told Americans were soft, yet their guards carry equipment that would exhaust 10 German soldiers. We were told America was starving, yet I eat here in one day more than my family saw in a week. We were told American society was corrupt and failing, yet their children beyond these fences grow strong while ours learn to eat sawdust bread." Ingrid stopped attempting to explain away the abundance surrounding them. The kitchen waste no longer seemed like theater. The medical supplies no longer appeared staged. Instead, she began studying English with determined intensity, copying words and phrases as if language itself might unlock the secret of how a nation could become so impossibly strong while maintaining the humanity their own leaders had abandoned. The questions that haunted the barracks grew more personal and devastating. If their government had lied about America's weakness, what other lies had shaped their lives? If German superiority was mythology, what had their sacrifices achieved? If the war had been unwinnable from the beginning, then every death, every destroyed city, every shattered family had been pointless waste. Winter deepened, and with it came a quiet transformation. The German women no longer saw themselves merely as prisoners of war. They had become witnesses to the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe, living evidence that propaganda could construct entire, false realities. And in that recognition, as painful and disorienting as it was, lay the first seeds of a different kind of understanding. March 1946. The harsh winter began its retreat across the Hudson Valley, leaving behind muddy fields and the promise of spring. Inside Camp Shanks, the German women faced a different kind of thaw, the melting away of illusions that had sustained them through years of war and deprivation. By now, the rhythm of camp life no longer felt temporary, but neither did it feel like imprisonment. It had become something else entirely, a glimpse into a world they had been taught could not exist. Greta Weber found herself fundamentally changed by her months in captivity. In the infirmary, she continued her work with steady hands, but her thoughts wandered constantly to the comparison between what she had known and what she now witnessed daily. One afternoon, while organizing medical supplies that arrived in quantities that still seemed almost magical, she paused to consider the stark mathematics of her situation. As a prisoner, an enemy of the American state, she received better medical care and more abundant food than she had ever known as a free citizen of the Third Reich. The irony cut deeper than any physical wound. Her own government had claimed to be building a 1,000-year empire while allowing its people to survive on turnip soup and ersatz coffee. Here, in the land they had been taught to despise as weak and degenerate, even enemies were treated with a casual abundance that spoke to strength beyond imagination. Ingrid Hoffman's transformation took a different path. Her initial defiance had evolved into something resembling scholarly curiosity. She filled notebook after notebook with English phrases, not merely words, but concepts that seemed foreign to her previous understanding of the world. Freedom of speech appeared repeatedly in her notes, along with due process and civilian oversight. These weren't just vocabulary exercises. They represented ideas that challenged everything she had been taught about how societies should function. Anna Richter's journal had grown into a detailed chronicle of cultural revelation. Her medical training had taught her to observe systematically, and what she observed defied every assumption about national character and racial superiority. The American Guards weren't specially selected specimens. They were simply ordinary young men who had grown up with adequate nutrition, education, and opportunity. Their strength wasn't genetic superiority, but the product of a society that invested in its people rather than consuming them. The announcement came in April that repatriation would begin soon. The news stirred conflicting emotions throughout the camp. Some women wept with relief at the prospect of seeing family again, while others felt dread at returning to a homeland that had fed them lies along with their meager rations. The America they were leaving behind was not the America they had been taught to hate, and the Germany they would return to was not the Germany they had been taught to love. On their final night in camp, Greta, Ingrid, and Anna sat together on the steps of their barracks, watching the sunset paint the Hudson Valley in shades of gold and crimson. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of spring insects and distant laughter from the guards' quarters. They spoke quietly about the future, about the impossibility of reconciling two completely different versions of reality. "How do we explain this to people who weren't here?" Greta asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we tell them that everything we believed was carefully constructed mythology?" Ingrid stared at her hands, roughened by months of kitchen work, but stronger than they had been in years thanks to adequate nutrition. "Perhaps our responsibility isn't to convince them," she said slowly. "Perhaps it's simply to remember, to be living proof that the world is larger and more complex than any propaganda can contain." Anna closed her journal for the final time, its pages filled with observations that would have been impossible to believe a year earlier. "We return as different people than we were when we left," she said. "We've seen behind the curtain of our own mythology. That knowledge changes everything." The train that carried them eastward toward the Atlantic was filled with an unusual quiet. German women who had arrived in America as confident believers in their nation's superiority now pressed their faces against windows, watching the American landscape unfold one last time. They saw the endless farms, the bustling factories, the bridges and cities that spoke to a prosperity built on principles they were only beginning to understand. When their ship finally departed New York Harbor, the women stood on deck watching the Statue of Liberty recede into the distance. They had come as enemies and lived as prisoners, but they departed as something unprecedented in their experience, witnesses to the dangerous power of truth. The America they left behind was not the America they had been taught to expect, and that difference would haunt their dreams long after the war had ended. Their return to Germany would bring new challenges, new questions about loyalty and truth and the price of believing comfortable lies. But they carried with them something their leaders had never intended them to possess, the certain knowledge that the world was vast enough to contain realities that propaganda could never capture, and strong enough to survive the collapse of even the most carefully constructed illusions. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to uncover more hidden stories that reveal the complex truths behind history's greatest conflicts.